Hello, my name is Megan Kincaid. I'm the curator of José Antonio Fernández-Muro, Geometry and Transfer, currently on view at the Institute for Studies on Latin American Art. Today, I'm going to be presenting a talk that I previously gave for the Graduate Student Forum South and About, held periodically at the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University. The talk, titled Recasting José Antonio Fernández-Muro, Geometry and Transfer, follows the boundaries of the exhibition and will primarily examine his luminous transfer paintings developed in the late 1950s in Buenos Aires by overlaying a variety of commercial grade stencils and metal sheets with perforations onto geometric schemes as a response to the conventions of concrete art in the region. Later elaborated on while living in New York City, beginning in 1962, his frottage compositions turned to urban imagery, impressing sheets of aluminum foil against sidewalks, sewer grates, and manhole covers, signaling further breaks from the non-representational dictates of concretism. Reconnecting these two bodies of work, executed in distinct centuries of mid-century artistic production, reveals the critical contiguities, visual, material, ideological, that reassert Fernández-Muro's displacement of key values of Argentine abstraction to new conceptual horizons and geographies. Whereas existing scholarship on the artist maintains that Fernández-Muro underwent a radical transformation or breakthrough once in New York, and particularly amid exposure to assemblage and pop art practices, this talk revives the unorthodox approaches to abstraction he formulated as early as 1952 when exhibiting alongside titans of Argentine abstraction like Tomás Maldonado and Alfredo Rito. Surveying his subversive expansion of geometric abstraction throughout a decade of feverish experimentation reconnects his New York imagery with his earlier uptake of the transfer technique and long-standing endeavors to pry open the established boundaries of concrete art. To begin, I would like to provide a sketch of the existing scholarship on and the historiographic treatment of the artist to demonstrate the significance and interconnectedness of the two primary maneuvers of this talk. Chiefly, the revision of the predominant argument that his work in New York represents a significant break in his practice, and second, that it is indeed a continuation of a radicalized form of abstraction begun in Buenos Aires. Moving to the Argentine capital in 1938 from Spain, at the outset of his artistic career, Fernández-Muro studied under Vicente Puig, developing an empathetic and psychologically rigorous figurative style. Looking closely at the paintings from the period also serves to connect his figural practice with the reemergence of street iconography like sewer grates and manhole covers, once in New York. His paintings from this era feature distraught and impoverished urban subjects embroiled in domestic trouble. A representative painting, La Vecina, the Neighbor of 1945, is a somber portrait of a middle-aged woman wearing a dress ornamented in a Baroque floral pattern posed on her balcony, overlooking a street in the urban center. What's more is that his portraits of the period typically opened onto these urban scenes, illustrating both the local architecture and the trade economy. In La Vecina, captivated by the operatics of transportation and commerce, Fernández-Muro depicted a horse-drawn carriage hauling precariously placed parcels to unknown destinations. The artist's attention to the street as a site of vital activity presaged his later transfer paintings of the mid-1960s that would then graph the actual surfaces of these thoroughfares. What followed was a swift embrace of concrete abstraction. By 1952, he exhibited among leading abstractionists as a member of Grupo de Artistas Modernas, GAMA, offering schematic geometrical compositions made dynamic by the friction between order and dissonance, as characterized by the slightly slanted vertical lines that disrupt perfect parallels in Verticales of 1955, which was exhibited at the Venice Biennale in 1956. These acute, irregular geometric forms and manipulations of the grid remind of Helio Oiticica's metaschemes, begun 2 years later in 1957, which recoded concrete art for the Brazilian context by similarly playing with what Professor Edward Sullivan has described as, quote, off-kilter grid schemes. Like Oiticica, Fernández-Muro continued to tease open the tightly sewn seams of concrete art, finding more expansive affordances of abstraction along other coordinates such as industry and design. A catalyzing opportunity arose in 1954, which would expose Fernández-Muro to design, industrial devices, and logics that unlocked possibilities in his fine art practice. Selected by the entrepreneur Jacopo Soifer to participate in the year-long collective Buen Diseño para la Industria, the artist and his wife joined Tomás Maldonado, Miguel Ocampo, and Alfredo Lito in producing textile swatches intended for mass production. The image on the screen shows an example of Fernández-Muro's modernist approach to textile design, returning to his signature configuration of stacked and stilted geometries, but noticeably creating a more variegated surface with incised line articulations that would lend fabrics a compelling texture. This crossover between industry and the avant-garde encouraged Fernández-Muro in his impulse to utilize commercial grade and products in his high art compositions, especially devices useful in generating textural overlays like those imagined in his designs for Buen Diseño. Shortly thereafter, he began to use perforated screens to add textured surfaces to his geometric paintings, the start of the transfer paintings at the center of the exhibition and this talk. These works, such as the two earliest in the show, Cuadrados en Espirio, Spiral Squares, 1959, and Círculo Azul, Blue Circle, 1960, overlaid a variety of metal grates, stencils, and other industrially produced devices onto complex, sweeping geometric composites. His experiments with the transfer technique compounded over the next few years and found new sources once he was living in New York, ultimately leading to his most celebrated series. A central work in the exhibition, Leaden Gate, 1964, is characteristic of the New York style. Made by impressing sheets of aluminum foil against the sidewalk, the painting transfers street surfaces, in this case a water hole cover, onto the supple metal sheet. The artist then assembled these embossed sheets in his studio and typically covered the compositions in resplendent gem-like hues, which critics at the time understood as a sanctification of the urban. Consulting the contents of the artist's archive, the most comprehensive resource on the interpretive approaches in historiographic treatment of the artist and currently on loan to ISLAA, what came into focus most prominently in its clippings of newspaper articles, reviews, and exhibition catalogs was the disproportionate attention placed on the artistic output during his 8 years in New York between 1962 and 1970. Impressively, his exhibitions with Galleria Bonino Gallery, an inestimably important conduit for Latin American art in the United States, were always sold out, with works flowing directly into major museum collections, including the Museum of Modern Art and the Guggenheim. Moreover, his supposed entry into the realm of recognizable imagery and engagement with the urban environment was commonly taken as a sign of his dalliance with pop art and the assemblage practices of Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg. Though the artist had previously utilized transfers to embellish his geometric paintings and transit systems and thoroughfares already populated his pictorial imaginary, his practice was quickly reassessed by critics as an extension of Pop's preoccupation with commonplace objects and mass culture. For instance, John Kennedy, the arts reporter for the New York Times, who extensively covered Fernández-Muro's exhibitions in the United States, as seen in one of the many clippings by the critic preserved and scored in the artist archive, he interpreted the appearance of manhole covers as what he would call, quote, an unexpected reflection of Pop's interest in the everyday, ultimately likening the practice of a Latin American modernist with Americans. A common practice and interpretive strategy of group exhibitions in the United States which focused on Latin American art. Indeed, it is a rather seductive argument to suggest that his impressions of street surfaces that captured images like the Campbell Foundry manhole covers was a sly inversion of the other Campbell made notorious during the period, a nod to Warhol soup cans exhibited first at Ferris Gallery in Los Angeles. This certainly was not lost on Fernández-Muro, who even titled a related painting, quote, Bonjour, Mr. Campbell. Yet even as this brief sketch of his chronology reminds, his interest in transfer techniques predated his exposure to related practices of members of the New York avant-garde, and emphatically track back to directions in Argentine modernism and his own historical positionality as part of the generation tasked with responding to and perhaps remedying concrete abstraction for a new decade. This modification of the artist's trajectory represents one of the manifest imperatives of a reassessment of Fernández-Muro's work, to connect rather than isolate his most celebrated moment and to squarely address the conditions which led to its institutional embrace during the 1960s beyond a mere privilege of his geographic relocation. On the other hand, the imperative of recasting Fernández-Muro is twofold. First, as I have tried to accomplish in the first section of my talk, to demonstrate his New York period as a continuation of the aesthetic convictions and material manipulations begun in Argentina. Second, in this revised focus on his work in Argentina, to also revivify a moment in Latin American modernist painting that has also become peripheral, namely the follow-ups to concrete art that broke with its orthodoxy and encompassed expressive or affective tendencies, materials, and imagery once considered anathema to the project of abstraction. In particular, attention to Fernández-Muro's work from the late 1950s and early 1960s in Buenos Aires reasserts the efforts of a short-lived cohort united under the name Grupo de los Cinco, in which Fernández-Muro and Grillo were central participants, a photograph of whom can be seen on the screen. During the 1950s, Fernández-Muro became associated with the forerunners of mid-century abstraction in Argentina, establishing himself as an important figure for what Jorge Romero Bress termed the, quote, intermediary generation, unquote, of Argentine artists who turned to abstraction in the late 1940s following the groundswell embrace of concretism by artists associated with Arturo, the magazine dedicated to a new form of non-representational art grounded in invention and the constructivist influence of the Uruguayan master Joaquin Torres Garcia. In the same year as Arturo's single-issue release, Fernández-Muro was still exhibiting still life paintings and portraiture. Paintings included in his solo exhibition with the prestigious Galleria Whitcomb in 1944 remind that at the time of abstraction's forceful emergence in Buenos Aires, figuration still maintained a strong place among the avant-garde. Yet within 5 years, Fernández-Muro became a fixture among a different vanguard, the abstractionists in Argentina, first as a member of Gama, established in 1952, and then as a key part of Grupo de los Cinco. Considered an independent abstract artist among the Gama cohort, Fernández-Muro exhibited alongside the chief proponents of concrete abstraction in the region, like Maldonado, Lito, Edgar Bailey. His contributions, seen as a revisal of principal tenets of orthodox concretism, introduced new directions in abstraction. Carrying with him his early training in figuration, as well as integrating the influence of international tendencies like gestural abstraction and lyrical expression, the artist joined the intermediary generation who reinterpreted and expanded concretism following its major breakthrough and unrealized utopian promises. Key to understanding the successor to concrete art in Argentina is a clipping from a Brazilian newspaper interview with Maldonado about concrete painting and the problems of abstract art, published on August 5, 1953. Speaking in Rio de Janeiro on the occasion of a Gama exhibition at the Museu de Arte Moderna do Rio, Maldonado expanded on the forces acting against modernism in Argentina, while celebrating those who, in his words, quote, favor modern tendencies and strive to lay the foundations of a current and living culture. Fernández-Muro, whose work was included in the group show, represented this contingent. In fact, he was promoted as the anonymous poster child for the generation carrying out, quote, the rebellion of the world, as the only reproduction in the article featured one of his contributions to the exhibition. His unidentified painting, comprising geometric compartments, notable again for invoking skewed and distorted geometries, and captioned as un bel quadro abstratto, a pretty abstract painting, stands between Maldonado and Miguel Ocampo and was positioned as the embodiment of a period of expansion in concrete art. Recognizing the painting as one of his own in a cursive inscription at the top of the torn-out newspaper page, Fernández-Muro inked, quote, "The painting is mine and has disappeared?" ? The disappearing painting represents the quiet contributions of Fernández-Muro to the progress of geometric abstraction in Argentina. His particular geometric schemas, notable in their slight irregularity and skewed orthogonal lines, represented the frontier of abstraction. Drawing on his extensive training with Puig, where he developed an interest in figuration that featured the stacked geometries of architectural facades, he quickly established a distinct abstract style that refigured variegated buildings into simple shapes. With geometric compartments incised with lines both delicate and hefty, these compositions were at the time exported as emissaries of the recent developments of the Argentine avant-garde. In addition to participating in the Gama exhibition in Rio, which traveled to the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, Fernández-Muro was featured in the Second Biennale de São Paulo in 1953, a chronological fact which might have implications for the proliferation of neoconcretism in Brazil. While the inaugural biennial in Brazil championed the rigid doctrine of concretism as expanded by Max Bill, Fernández-Muro in his cohort would reimagine this orthodoxy and radically revise its mathematical purity 2 years later. Approaching his first transfer paintings outfitted with this context, I would like to consider the theoretical stakes of his material manipulations and renegotiated vision of hard-edged geometry as a heuristic for consulting his paintings across this 10-year span. In Circulo Azul, a luminous circle and cavernous expanse of loosely defined geometries, is overpainted with numerous campaigns using perforated surfaces, with the repetition of the grid transfer producing dizzying optical effects and the essence of luminality. Essentially, one of the staples of concrete art, used to assign ordered, logical construction, is used against its prescripts, a well-established strategy for the artist. Instead, the grid exacerbates the effective charge of the painting, destabilizing and disorienting through its decorative overcoat. These expressive surfaces, layered onto hard-edged compositions, characterize Fernández-Muro's advancement of concrete art. This operation, of expanding the scope of concrete art by subverting the very tools of its purity, also unlocks a more nuanced conceptualization of his aluminum impressions of street surfaces undertaken in downtown New York. Although the austere language of paintings such as Leaden Gate might initially appear inhospitable to this observation, I believe there is a great deal of parodic playfulness at hand. Consider the following. By selecting street surfaces with emphatic geometries like the circular manhole cover and the rectangular subway grate, Fernández-Muro transposed recognizable images into abstract devices. In short, what he might suggest to those weary of the interloping of abstraction with the representational or the recognizable is that a circle is a circle. The career-long compositional strategy of his paintings, whether pure abstractions or solid abstractions, is a consistent use of overlapping geometrical schemas. In Leaden Gate, 1964, which contains a city utility cover, the rectangle is the primary element of the composition. A gem-like work in the exhibition, Great Society, also hinges on this substitutional logic. The rows of pennies, which have undeniable metaphoric significance ranging from national identity to political and economic purchase, conform to the traditional grid. Merging polysemic interpretation and reductionist abstraction, the artwork asserts that commonplace symbols, depending on geometric forms, can take on non-representational properties. For Fernández-Muro, symbols proffered abstract potential. In some cases, direct political commentary. So ingrained in our visual worlds, they operate fugitively, slipping between the crevices of social context back to the geometric and the elemental. Conducting this reading in reverse, I wanted to propose an alternate method of constructing in discourse around an artist who practiced an unconventional mode of abstraction at mid-century, appearing as it stands to productively negotiate the conventions and codes of Argentine concrete art. Within this framework, the occurrence of recognizable imagery in the 1960s finds a more convincing causality. Not only can we see a North American example in his turn to street iconography, moreover, we can identify a consistent pattern of subversive abstraction. By locating its elemental building blocks, geometric forms like the circle and square, and organizing structures like parallel lines and the grid, Fernández-Muro excavated space within concrete art for the symbolic and the sensuous. Thank you so much.